very much. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks to the team for being able to kind of arrange the technology so that I can do this and talk to you all online. I'm Katy Whitaker. As I mentioned, I know various of you have spoken to you about previous projects I've been working on or know you in other ways. I work at Historic England, but I'm also completing a PhD at the University of Reading. The project is co-supervised by the University of Reading and the University of Southampton. And I'm researching the use of Sarsen stone across its wider distribution in southern and southeastern England. In particular, the different ways that Sarsen stone has been quarried and worked in the past. So the talk has got 3 sections. I'm going to explain what Sarsen stone is and where it's found. That's going to include a closer look at the stone around Swindon, and that's probably the first sort of half really of this talk. Then we're going to just take a brief look at some of the different ways that the stone has been used since the Neolithic, but really just a brief look because you can see so much of it around you today. And then finally at the end, we're going to take a flying visit to 2 post-medieval quarry sites that you can go to and explore today. So just to let you know, I'm going to be using PowerPoint. Now, I know some of you are on different devices, on iPads, for example, where you touch the screen. I'm hoping that nobody's going to have any difficulty like losing the presentation, losing the feed or what have you. And we'll crack on. I'm sure it'll be, I'm sure we'll manage. Okay. So I just need to make a few acknowledgements. My project at the university, it's the first detailed look at Sarsen stone in its own right as a material that's been used since prehistory in construction and for other activities in people's lives. But my project is funded, luckily, by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I have advice from Professor Martin Bell, Dr. Jim Leary and Professor Josh Pollard, who are helping me, giving me advice on the project. The field work that I've carried out over the course of the past few years with Dr. Elaine Jameson and Dr. Christina Trusco, my friends and colleagues, really couldn't have done the field work without them. And then, of course, thanks to landowners, archive holders, museums, individuals, and many more people than are on this list. I've just picked up really the kind of the main people that I just want to pass my thanks on to for doing this project. And yeah, it's a much longer list. They'll all be on pages in the acknowledgements section in my thesis. I can't thank people and organisations enough. It's so important. So this is part of the Valley of Stones up on the Marlborough Downs in Wiltshire. And often this is the scene that's shown in geology or archaeology books describing Sarsen stone. It's often what people have in mind when they're thinking about Sarsen stone in the landscape. And in some counties, notably in Wiltshire and Dorset, there are areas like this with these Sarsen stone spreads. The valley is full of grey weathers. You have to ask yourself, are these sheep or are they stones? So what is this material? And why are these boulders lying about in the turf over the chalk hills? What is Sarsen stone? People have been asking this question for many years. It's one of the youngest stones found in Britain. It's often found on or close to the surface. It's commonly associated with the chalk downs, as we have here in Wiltshire, in Dorset, in Sussex, for example. But in the east and the southeast of England, it's more usually buried in the superficial geological deposits, buried in the clay with flints and the brick earth, for example, on the Chiltern Hills in South Buckinghamshire. So we're going to start with some of the early theories about what it is and where it's come from. Sir Christopher Wren's theory was mentioned by his friend, the antiquary John Aubrey. Aubrey was writing between the 1650s and the 1690s. They were discussing the geology of Wiltshire, and it was problematical because the hard grey Sarsen stone was so different to the soft white chalk that they knew was just underneath the turf and the soil. Sarsen stone needed explanation because it didn't fit, it didn't belong. And Christopher Wren thought that the boulders had come from volcanic eruptions, that volcanoes had thrown up these hard boulders that had flown through the air and landed at a distance in the landscape. That was Sir Christopher Wren's theory, his way of explaining Sarsen stones. About 100 years later, in 1743, William Stukely wrote about his theory. And again, he was talking about Wiltshire, but of course, what he said could be applied to Sarsen stones anywhere with chalk hills that have got the boulders on them. And William Stukely wrote, "This whole county hereabouts is a solid body of chalk, covered with a most delicate turf. As this chalky matter hardened at creation, it spewed out the most solid body of the stones of greater specific gravity than itself, and assisted by the centrifuge power owing to the rotation of the globe upon its axis, threw them upon its surface, where they now lie." In 1787, another antiquary called Daines Barrington published his alternative theory. He acknowledged Sarsen stone's difference to the underlying geology, and he also noted that unlike normal rocks, they are single boulders commonly on the surface. That's how he saw them. So he thought they must have been transported from somewhere else by immense natural forces. And he proposed that an earthquake had squirted the Sarsens out of the earth and thrown them miles away to their present locations. Of course, Sarsen stones have a folklore. They have numerous other names. They're known as breeding stones, for example, stones that grow. In folklore, they are natural living things that appear in the fields like mushrooms. If you take Sarsen stones out of a field, it won't be long before more appear. One of the earliest descriptions of Sarsen stone in a geological sense that we would recognize today was by George Greenough in 1819. At this time, geological science was leading to an understanding of the geological succession, the order of layers of rock. This is the idea the Earth's crust is made up of these layers of different rock types they've developed over a very long period of time. George Greenough recognized that the Sarsen stones were part of the layers that had previously overlain the chalk, but which were now highly eroded. He said that the Sarsens are evidently derived from the destruction of a rock which once lay over the chalk in the tertiary deposits overlying the Cretaceous chalk. Now, there's considerable uncertainty as to which layers the Sarsen stones formed in. In our area, those higher layers survive only in part in Savernake. If you want to go and see tertiary geology in situ, you would have to go to Savernake and cut a section to see substantial quantities of those rocks that once overlay the whole of the chalk. In 1854, Joseph Prestwich, another really important geologist, he concluded that Wiltshire Sarsens had been formed in the tertiary Woolwich and Reading beds. In Sussex, Stephen Ulliott, who published a really important paper in 2004, and the team that he was working with, they concluded that the Sussex Sarsens had been formed again in the tertiary beds, but in the Upnor formation. So it's likely that Sarsen stones were formed in different sandy deposits and at different times as well. They aren't all precisely the same thing. So the next question is, how were they formed? So I have to thank my colleague David Nash for these drawings, for this diagram. We're going to start with box number 1 in the top left-hand corner of the screen of the slide. In the Cretaceous period, more than 80 million years ago, chalk was being formed at the bottom of a shallow, warm sea. And that's what you can see, the turquoise blue line at the top with these tiny, tiny creatures that have chalk in their exoskeletons. And as those tiny creatures die, they drift down to the bottom of this shallow, warm sea. And gradually, over a very long period of time, these really thick layers of chalk build up. We'll move on to image 2 of the diagram. The chalk stopped being deposited at the same time that the Alpine mountains were being formed, and ripples of tectonic pressure caused deformation, which formed the London Basin and the Hampshire Basin. And we're on the edge of the London Basin and the Hampshire Basins. We move down to image 3 in the diagram. Later sediments built up in those basins during the Paleogene around 60 million years ago. That includes the Lambeth Group, which includes a sequence of sands and clays and gravels, and then the London clay formation over the top of those. These are all softer rocks, which they weathered, and because they weathered, the water table lowered. So let's go to box 4 in the diagram. Groundwater, which was carrying dissolved silica, we don't know where that silica is from, but it was there, percolated through these deposits until it hit that lowered water table. And at that point, it can't go any lower, it could only go sideways. And so it moved amongst these deposits of sandy and pebbly sediment. Now the silica is quartz, and that silica cemented some of the sediment, forming concreted lenses. In some places, that was happening relatively close to the surface because there are fossilized root holes in some sarsens. So we can actually see that. And these concreted lenses are going to become the Sarsen boulders. So we move on to image 5 in this diagram. Further later erosion stripped away the overlying deposits in many places. As I mentioned, all that remains in Wiltshire is in Savernake, and there are a few small patches in southeast Wiltshire too, but the erosion removed any uncemented material, but left behind the hard cemented sarsen stones. Clay with flints deposits were formed from a portion of the eroded deposits and from flints and clay that actually dissolve out of the chalk. And sarsens, therefore, are found on the remaining chalk hills or on the valley sides or valley bottoms where they slid during the thawing at the end of the last ice age. So that's why we find the boulders on the surface of the chalk, in the valleys, and mixed up in the clay with flints. As a result, surviving sarsen cobbles and boulders are scattered across southern and eastern England. They include a type of sarsen in Devon that formed by slightly different means, slightly different processes, called pedogenic sarsen. So we're not going to talk about that today. But then also the more familiar sarsen boulders from Dorset right across to Kent and up into Norfolk. That's what all of these slightly smudgy black dots on this map are representing. So the greatest concentrations today, as we can see them, are in Wiltshire. And you can see mostly over the pale green coloured geology on this map, which is the chalk. At the moment, we know very little about precisely which geological deposits the sarsen stones were formed in, as I mentioned, or when. They need not have been formed in exactly the same deposits above the chalk, or even at the same time in the geological past. And because they are residual, so lying about on the surface or buried in the clay with flints, the British Geological Survey doesn't map them. So I've had to make black spots on this map just to show you the general distribution, but I've made them purposefully fuzzy because they're not representing the position of an individual stone or an individual group of stones necessarily. It's the rough positions of where you can find sarsen stones as they are reported in the different geological literature, but they haven't ever been mapped in the way that the rest of the underlying geology that we're familiar with, these multicolours on this map, have been recorded. So normally at this point, I would hand around some pieces of rock, and we might have even had a microscope and some thin some thin sections in slides to look at. But obviously we're not doing that because we're not meeting in person, sensibly so. So you just have to imagine what this feels like, or think back to times that you've been amongst sarsen stones. Sarsen is usually a pure quartz sand with maybe only the occasional flint pebble caught up in the sand. And the thin sections on the right-hand side of the slide show you just how much quartz there is in sarsen stone. You're looking at these shades of grey, white through to black, and there are no bright colours of other minerals. There's no bright green or bright orange or red or purple or anything in these two thin sections. Sarsen stone is usually well over 90% quartz because the sand grains and the silica that cements the sand together are all quartz. That means it's also very dense, hard, tough. It's also quite brittle. so it can be split very cleanly to leave smooth, fairly straight faces. So let's take a closer look at Sarsen stones in and around Swindon. This map, I hope it's going to show clearly enough on the screen. I was making these the other day with fingers crossed that they display well enough. So this map shows the area of Swindon and some surrounding settlements. To the lower right, we've got the rising chalk hills. So I hope that you can imagine, let's just see if I can find the pointer. There we go. Here we go. So I hope you can imagine perhaps driving up out of Wroughton here, or coming through Chiseldon, or coming through Wanborough and driving up onto the chalk hills, extending southwards towards Marlborough. Swindon, so I've got the urban area of Swindon here, almost but not quite in the middle of the map. So Swindon is built on older geological deposits. They extend towards the top left, the upper part of the map. And I'm using two data sets here to give us information about the presence of Sarsen stone. So this is not perfect mapping of every single instance of Sarsen stone there is. I've just picked two data sets to make these particular maps. One of them is the Sarsen stones of Wessex survey. It dates to the mid-1970s. And that was a project carried out by the Society of Antiquaries of London. Around about 100 volunteers made records for Sarsen stones in Wiltshire, Dorset and Hampshire. And in the Swindon area, Bryn Walters and Bernard Phillips were the most active volunteers. So these records are represented by the black circles. You can see that there are various of these black dots on the chalk, but there are also a number lower down on these older deposits here through Swindon, and largely in this southeast and east area of Swindon. The second data set is represented by these black triangles. These are records created by Lynn Amadio, who's many of you will know through the Wiltshire Archaeological Field Group. Lynn has been able to fill in certain areas of central and western Swindon, looking for Sarsen stones that are in the built-up area. So that enables us to push the records a bit further here towards the top left corner of the map. And I'm very grateful to Lynn for providing me with information from her research on this. Some of these records are duplicate records. So you'll see, for example, we've got some dots, circles, black circles and black triangles really very close together. They are in fact duplicate records. I've not gone to the extent of removing them for the purpose of making these maps, but it gives us this good distribution. Now, we shouldn't be surprised to see Sarsen stones away from the chalk, off the chalk on the older geology. It reminds us that although we know quite a lot about how Sarsen stones are formed, we know very little about the geological deposits in which they formed. As I mentioned, there's no surviving tertiary geological formation surviving here that could have been the parent material for the Sarsen boulders. And beyond the northwest facing chalk scarp, here, all of the chalk has been eroded away that would have been in the top part of the map. That's all gone. The Sarsens in and around Swindon could have been remnants of that very long history of geological erosion. Some could have even been formed in some of the older deposits. In a privately published booklet of 1948, J.B. Jones records Sarsens being excavated, natural boulders that is, being excavated from sand deposits in Parkfield, so an area of houses being built to the south of the lawns now. And he records the builders hitting sand deposits and actually seeing the boulders being excavated from those deposits. It may well have been the geology in which they formed. It's still all very, very curious and uncertain. It requires a good deal more research, including exploring the geochemistry of the boulders to unpick it. It's a really big research area. So let's just focus on some of those 1970s records for a moment and get a better idea of the kind of things that were being recorded. So what I've done here in this map is to show the records where sarsen stones were noted as building material in walls. These are the black squares. So where people observed bits of sarsen stone or whole boulders being used in walls, in structures as squares, where they were seen on verges. So perhaps stopping people from driving and parking up on the verge. The verges are black circles in this map. But then also where natural cobbles and boulders have been seen excavated directly from the ground, but not from an archaeological site. Now they're a bit harder to see. I hope that you can get them, but there are these boulder shapes. I've used the Ordnance Survey's official symbol for boulders. So all of these that I'm just sort of spinning the pointer around, these are all boulders that had been excavated from the ground, straight out of the ground, but not from an archaeological context. And you can see that spreads out quite a way. Again, the distribution shouldn't surprise us. If the 1970s research project had extended further over into the top right-hand corner of this map, into Berkshire and Oxfordshire, there would have been even more records like this, of sarsen stones in building walls, of sarsen stones dotted around verges, people using them to stop vehicles driving over the verges, and these natural boulders excavated straight out of the ground. And we would have seen that carrying on up the map, following the chalk and following the chalk scarp and following the older geology around Ashbury and around Shrivenham. The boulders, sarsen boulders as we know them, are regularly dug up in this farmland, especially in places like Berrycroft Farm and Stainswick Farm, which you might know, which are here between Shrivenham and Ashbury. There are hundreds of sarsen boulders to be found here. We just don't have written records for them because these projects haven't extended into that area. And in fact, just on the right-hand edge of the map here, this is the B road that takes you down to Ashdown House, and some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the natural spread of sarsen stones that lies out on the grass in front of Ashdown House that you can go and walk in, you can go and visit. Lynn Amadio's data, collected more recently, is very similar. Many of the sarsen stones that are visible in Swindon today are being used as ornaments and landscape features. There's something like 300 boulders here at the Arclight building off Mead Way. This is a building that was designed by the architects Richard Hewell Evans. It was completed in 1999. I'm sure some of you can bring the building to mind with this amazing glass structure. Now, I haven't yet been able to find out where these particular sarsen stones came from, where the architects and where the contractors got them from. I have tried to get in touch with them, but no answer yet. Maybe they were available locally. Maybe they were brought in and as part of the landscaping from closer deposits. But there has been, and there still is, a trade in sarsen stone from the farms, some of the farms on the Marlborough Downs. So maybe these actually come from a bit further south. I don't know yet, and I'd really like to find out. Sarsen stones are familiar to us in prehistoric monuments, not least at Stonehenge and Avebury, of course. But what about the Swindon area? Setting aside the monuments on the chalk uplands, which we've got in the bottom left of the map here and the bottom right, these are mostly sarsen stones being used in the construction of Bronze Age round barrows. Not exclusively, but mostly that's what these crosses represent. But we've got some candidates that are a little bit closer to home. So we're going to concentrate on the 4 crosses that are up here. Stanton Fitzwarren. There's a standing stone at Stanton Fitzwarren. This was reported in 1922 by A.D. Passmore, and he carried out a small excavation at the stone in 1920. It's an unmodified sarsen boulder, so a natural sarsen boulder, but it's set upright on the side of a lane. And he described very briefly the results of the excavation. He found that the stone was sitting on the underlying natural geology in this part of the village. Unfortunately, it is unlikely to be a prehistoric monument. It doesn't appear on the Ordnance Survey maps until 1920. It's not on either of the previous Ordnance Survey maps. And you know, the Ordnance Survey, they're really usually very good at picking up and recording these sorts of details. So the fact that the stone isn't marked on the map until 1920 is a wee bit suspicious. That's also quite normal for Sarsen stones. There's another example, which just not in this particular data set, but there's another example in the fields down here in the bottom left-hand side of the map at Fiddler's Hill, where there's a beautiful standing Sarsen stone at the edge of a field. Again, it doesn't appear on the Ordnance Survey maps until the 1970s, as late as the 70s. It's not on any of the earlier maps. So it's highly likely that it's an inconvenient stone. Perhaps it was hit by the plough, dragged to the side of the field, and at some point was actually put upright as a standing stone. Looks really prehistoric, but it really probably isn't. And there are various examples like that. And the Stanton Fitzwarren stone, I think that's probably what that is. Unfortunately, not prehistoric. Dayhouse Farm Circle at Dayhouse Lane and the Standing Stone at Broome Manor. Now, these are much more likely candidates for prehistoric Sarsen monuments. John Aubrey recorded the Standing Stone at Broome Manor. That's this cross here on the left-hand side in the oval. It was 10 feet tall, so quite a substantial stone in a field called Longstone. That's always a good sign. At some point, we don't know quite when, but at some point that stone was dragged away, as were other boulders, other Sarsen stones in the field. But again, Passmore, A.D. Passmore, he reported that the socket in which the long stone had stood was still visible in the field as late as 1894. The other broken boulders in Longstone Field the other boulders had been taken, broken up, and actually had been used as roadstone in Cricklade, of all places. There's actually an account of that they went off and were taken away for roadstone and used in Cricklade. The stone circle, so here, Dayhouse Farm on Dayhouse Lane on the right-hand side, it's partial. There are still some boulders that you can see in the fields either side of the lane. That was first noted by Richard Jeffreys, actually, reported by Richard Jeffreys in 1868. And it was also recorded by Passmore. Passmore felt that other Sarsen stones around the farm in this area, around Cote Water, he thought a lot more were actually prehistoric settings. But I think it's fair to say that they are less convincing. The stone circle is really convincing, and it is in fact a scheduled ancient monument. When complete, if it was complete, it would have been about 92 meters across. And although not all of the stones survive, there are buried archaeology sockets in which other stones as part of the circle had stood. So I think we can be quite confident about the standing stone at Broome Manor and the circle. Not so convinced by some of the other features that Passmore in particular in his notebooks described. But if only we could investigate them in more detail. And then the Nightingale Farm standing stone. Now this is a bit of a puzzle. Passmore again, Passmore recorded a large stone slab at Nightingale Farm, which bore the impression of a human footprint and was known as the Devil's Footprint. Well, that was the 1920s. By 1968, when the Ordnance Survey visited, no one at the farm remembered the stone. Given its location, it was probably part of a cluster of Sarsen stones around Fir Clump at Birdrop Wood in this area, which is the location of another possible circle described by Passmore that was lost in the construction of the M4, which is the pale blue line running across the slide. So the strongest evidence for prehistoric Sarsen settings is the Broome Manor Longstone, the circle at Dayhouse Farm, and there may well have been other stone settings in the area. Aubrey Burl, in an article published in 2004, he was quite convinced of all of A.D. Passmore's descriptions of all these different stone settings. I'm less certain. I'm less certain because it is very easy to visualize stone settings, lines of stones or arcs of stones or circles of stones in groups of Sarsens that are lying about on the ground. If you don't take proper geological account of why the boulders are there in the first place and closely examine the land use history and think about how stones have been moved and what they've been used for, it's really difficult to be sure whether things are actually prehistoric settings or not. But it's a really interesting area around Cote, and it really deserves a lot more serious research. I'm looking at Mike McQueen here. I'm thinking about geophysics, and I'm wondering what we could perhaps organise in the future. So I want to touch briefly on some of the many and varied ways that Sarsen stone has been used. And these two photos maybe meet expectations of some, at least, Sarsen stone building material. These are both examples in Wiltshire villages, the so-called Sarsen villages. Here I've picked East Kennet and Avebury. They include regularly split and shaped building blocks and considerable quantities of gate and street furniture. So on the left-hand side, this end cottage in East Kennet, it's got a butting joint to the neighbouring house. It's probably a 19th century addition to an earlier 18th century brick-built dwelling. Whereas on the right-hand side, in Avebury, we've got a typical Sarsen and brick barn in the background with a substantial Sarsen gate pier, which is beautifully squared and dressed. Well, there have been numerous ways to get hold of Sarsen stone and to prepare it at different times and in different places. If you want, you can just use the boulders, a bit like they were used to make stone circles in prehistory. This example is the grotto at White Knights in Reading. It's actually on the University of Reading campus. It was built sometime between 1810 and 1819 by the Marquis of Blandford. The Marquis of Blandford, Gorgeous George, was the son of the Duke of Marlborough. And the Duke of Marlborough, of course, owned large areas of Wiltshire countryside, where these boulders are naturally found, up in the Valley of Stones. It was owned by the Duke of Marlborough. And the Marquis, who was a fantastic garden designer, really talented and absolutely fanatical, he arranged for cartloads of the Sarsen boulders from the Valley of Stones to be collected and then had them shipped to Reading on the newly opened Kennet and Avon Canal. The grotto was described by a visitor, and I'm going to quote, "Conches of glowing pink or bold black and white are seen on every side, and large masses of glittering spar of rich violet hue or shining white, crystals, ores, nautili, and ear shells give variety to the internal decorations, while at the entrance, many noble clams and conches are scattered around. On the top is placed a magnificent nautilus, and a little below, an immense brainstone studded with green moss." It doesn't quite look like that now. All of the additional decoration have all been lost, and we're left with this massive structure. It's grade 2 listed, that's above the lake on the campus. It's one of the few designed landscape features surviving, actually. Churches are one of the building types, which it's very common to find Sarsen stone boulders. They often appear like this. They're large boulders in key locations in the foundations, and you might see them underpinning corners or buttresses. Now, archaeologist and clergyman Reverend Peter Gallop, who did his Sarsen stone research in Hampshire, he thought that churches like this, with Sarsen stones like this, had been built on a previously pagan site of a stone circle made of Druid stones, which is one of the other names for Sarsens. And he quotes Hilaire Belloc for the source of his source of the tradition. The idea is that the building Christianizes the supposed stone circle. Well, the name Druid stones is an interesting one. For a while in the mid-19th century, geologists called Sarsens Druid stones. It was used like an official name, and it came about because people saw Sarsens mostly in prehistoric monuments. But Druid stone is hardly scientific, and it suggests that all such stones, wherever you find them, are something to be defined in magical terms, rather than, say, geological terms or historical terms. And if Peter Gallop was right, then there are an awful lot of prehistoric stone circles recycled into churches in Hampshire, and no surviving megalithic monuments at all in the county. So I'm not so sure about his theory. It's true that some churches are built on or near prehistoric monuments. Obviously, Avebury and Knowlton are really good examples of that. But before we can claim that all churches with Sarsens like this are on the site of a stone circle, we have to look into the building history in a lot more detail. In particular, what Victorian restoration and reordering has gone on at the church. Why are boulders like this so visible? What's happened here? How do other local buildings use Sarsen stones in their fabric? It's also clear that building blocks of Sarsen stone, regular enough to be laid in proper courses, have been produced for a number of years, hundreds of years in fact. This slide is part of Windsor Castle's Great Curtain Wall on the west end of the castle. It was built in the 1220s. Windsor Castle's main building stone is Sarsen. All of the castle, the whole of Windsor Castle, which is huge, is built of Sarsen stone. So I'm hoping that you can see the difference between medieval blocks, and they're quite regular, but the difference between them and the really regular Victorian blocks. This stuff at the top was added on by Salvin in the 1860s. And then we've got a lace of limestone. A lace of, here we go, limestone running through, but it's mostly Sarsen. Huge volumes of Sarsen stone were required to build the walls and the towers of the medieval castle. And the surviving accounts for various years describe the literally hundreds of thousands of boulders that were sourced and split by teams of stonemasons who were supplying the king's works. So, for example, in 1364, to Henry le Smith and his fellows for splitting 156,000 heath stones, again, that's another name for Sarsen, 156,000 heath stones at Collingley for the aforesaid works at 20 shillings per thousand, total £156 4 shillings. Now, I did mention the Chiltern Hills, Buckinghamshire and the Chiltern Hills before. There's evidence here in this area for substantial Sarsen stone quarrying and trade on the Chiltern Hills, focused on Hughenden parish, which is to the northwest of High Wycombe. We're not sure yet when this trade began, but there are very well executed buildings in finely dressed Sarsen blocks from around about the 1800, the very early 1800s. Examples include Wycombe Abbey in High Wycombe, which was reworked in Sarsen stone by Wyatt around 1805. The Old Town Hall in Marlow, which is a similar date, and the farmhouse and barns at Denner Hill around about 1803, 1804. So it's likely that the trade developed in this area in the 18th century. Excuse me. So on this slide, at the top, we have an extract from a lease agreement of 1740, and it names Thomas Watts of the borough of Chipping Wycombe, which is High Wycombe now, in the county of Berks, stone cutter. Now, he could have been a monumental mason, it's true, but it's also possible that he was a specialist Sarsen stone cutter, because it is the only hard stone in the area. On the Chiltern Hills, the area, or the chalk, is covered by a thick deposit of plateau drift and clay with flints. The Sarsen stones are buried in that. Brickmaking was a byproduct of the stone quarries. So what we've got here on the left, circled in this area, hopefully you can see lots of squiggly black dots, and these are all stone pits in this area. And this is what it looks like in the bottom of a stone pit, with massive boulders stuck in the side of the pit. This is about 15 meters deep from the surface above, surrounded by brick earth. This will all be dug out to make bricks, and they're taking the Sarsen boulders here at the bottom. Products from the Buckinghamshire quarries include fine building materials, like the example on the left from the church at Prestwood. It's 1849 by E.B. Lamb. So you can see it's mostly flint with these beautiful Sarsen stone blocks, these quoins here in the buttress. But probably the greatest volume of Sarsen from the quarries went for street furniture. And this example here is Aylesbury Market Square. It's paved in Sarsen stone sets. It's a huge area. And you can see examples like this in Swindon, in Oxford, in Reading, lots of Sarsen stone street furniture, curbstones and sets being used by the local authorities in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. And we also know that stonecutters, Sarsen stonecutters from these Buckinghamshire quarries moved to Wiltshire in 1847 to take advantage of the boulders that conveniently lay on the surface. So let's finish up by looking back here in Wiltshire at two of these Sarsen extraction stone sites that you can go and visit yourself. So we're going to start off in Pickledene, just north of the A4 and west of Marlborough, and then we'll go to Westwards. Pickledene is a dry chalk valley in West Overton parish. It's on the north side of the River Kennet, between Avebury and Marlborough. The valley begins up on the downs and it curves south and east towards the River Valley. And in the valley bottom, you'll find Pickledene Barn. The footpath runs through here, through the valley to the A4. And you can get in either end. And at this end here, this green, thin green strip at the bottom of this map, this is a piece of land owned by the National Trust. We're going to look at that, and in particular, this survey transect in here. I mentioned the Duke of Marlborough before. This property became part of the Duke of Marlborough's estates in 1726. And Pickledene Barn up here had been built by 1733. It appears on the Andrews and Jury map of 1733. Under the Duke of Marlborough's management, Overton Manor was divided into two farms, North Farm, which is down here in the bottom left-hand corner, and South Farm, which is the other side of the river. You can see here, the stream is actually, or the river, is through here in the bottom of the map. So these new buildings, his new North Farm, the first stone was laid in 1801, and we've got a mixture of Sarsen stone and cob-walled barns and yards, which were built first. And then finally, the brick farmhouse was the last thing to be built at North Farm. And at the time of this first Ordnance Survey 25-inch map, which was published in 1887, the farmhouse and the yards were in place. Pickledene Barn had been developed into an out farm. There was a cottage up here at the top of the map, housing a shepherd and agricultural labourers. And there were still hundreds of Sarsen stones in the valley, and that's what all these speckles are, the Ordnance Survey representing the Sarsen stones. So this is what it looks like. You can see that the bottom of the valley is full of Sarsen stones, and there are cultivated fields to either side. We know from documentary evidence that the Cartwright family of Buckinghamshire, as I mentioned before, Buckinghamshire Sarsen cutters, were working somewhere here in Pickledene around about 1915. And there's also a photo to the north of this particular location, close to Pickledene Barn, cutters working in 1908, so before and during the First World War. But we don't know when Sarsen stone cutting first started here in Pickledene. So if you imagine a detailed survey running across this valley bottom, creating this plan. So this is a plan of the detailed survey transect across the valley bottom, north to the top. So you've got on the left this steep slope down of the west side of the valley into the valley bottom, and another bit of a slope here before we head off, and the valley slopes back up on the right hand side of the slide. Within this transect area, there are 156 surviving stones, which are coloured in grey. And then there are quarry pits that stones have been taken out from. They're these oval shapes where stones have been removed. And some of them have got some stone debris and waste in them. This one up here at the top of the map also has got a broken stone and stone debris in them. But there are also quite a few whole Sarsens here that don't appear to have been touched, some that have been split and abandoned. It's quite a mixture. And I wanted just to take a little closer look at one of the stone groups. We're going to look at this one. Now, by the magic of the internet, I hope what's going to happen is I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint slide and I'm going to reshare this stone group, and then we'll come back to the PowerPoint slide. So fingers crossed this is all going to work. So first of all, oh, and my phone is going. We'll just have to ignore the fact that my phone is ringing. I'll put myself on mute briefly. Okay, thankfully my phone has stopped ringing. So what I'm hoping is, and I'm not quite sure how well this is behaving, but what I'm hoping is that you can see this group of stones, split stones with these large perpendicular lines through them. It's not perfectly behaving, is it? But I'm hoping just to give you the impression of what it looks like to see these stones split. They're starting to prepare them, to break them up. They're going to be made into building blocks or street furniture. And then for whatever reason, they abandoned this and walked away. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing the PowerPoint now. So this group of stones, and perhaps you can see also from the still photo, these beautifully perpendicular lines. These blocks really do look like they could make really good building blocks, but for whatever reason, they walked away. And if you go for a walk in Pickledene, you can see this throughout the valley, and start to look at the finer details of what remains of the quarry. The majority of these stones were split using this flat wedge method. This is the method that's reported to have been brought from Buckinghamshire to Wiltshire in the late 1840s. And this method leaves these scars on the stone. So you can see on this boulder, which has been broken in half, it's been split in half, the quarryman prepared this beautifully chiseled hole into which a flat wedge was inserted and then hammered to split the stone apart. And you're left with this scar on one half of the stone and the opposite scar, the equivalent of the other half of this wedge pit on the other half of the stone. So again, you can start to see these, the closer you look, paying attention to the boulders, and you'll start to see these in the stones if you go out for a walk in Pickledene or further up onto the Marlborough Downs. It's a really characteristic feature to look out for. And just to show you what that looks like in a building, so two examples of the bottoms of those wedge pit scars. This is St. Catherine's Church in Savernake, which was built in 1861 and then had to be partially rebuilt in 1952 because it got blown up. But we've got, hopefully you can see in the circles, the marks where these beautifully finished blocks were actually split out of Sarsen boulders, and these show us where the wedges had gone. So here's a lovely archive photograph of one of the very last, some of the very last Sarsen stone cutting to be happening on the Marlborough Downs. This is near Old Totterdown in 1935. And hopefully you can see this man is holding a tracing hammer and a slicing chisel. So this is a chisel held in a twisted piece of hazel. Here are some examples of those chisels from the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes. and he's making stone sets to go into for street furniture or to make surfaces. And there are millions of these in and around Swindon. Highworth, various places, not Wootton Bassett. Wootton Bassett has very little Sarsen stone street furniture. Highworth has got lots. Go figure, Highworth never had the canal, for example. Bassett had the canal and the railway, didn't have Sarsen stone. So you have to ask ourselves what was happening there and why is that? But millions of these blocks in Swindon. What's clear from the survey work in Piggledene is that more than one splitting technique was used there. Most Sarsen stones were split using those flat wedges, but a few were split using this plug and feather method. Not many, just a few. It's a technique that was introduced to quarrying around about 1800, which uses a circular section wedge with 2 half-cylinder feathers to split the stone apart. So we don't know, is this contemporary splitting using different techniques? Is it work at different dates or by different teams working in the valley using different tools? There's quite a lot still to try to unpick. So I'm just very briefly going to finish up then with a second location that you can visit. We're going to head a little further south to Westwards, to the southwest of Marlborough in the Kennet Valley. It's another location you can go to. Look it up on the Forestry Commission's website. There's car parking, so you can go and well made up tracks like this, as well as going off the beaten track to go around and explore the woods. I'm sure many of you've been there before, perhaps at bluebell time in May. It's beautiful. We're going to look at a completely different type of Sarsen stone quarry here, because well as some traditional working in the mid-19th century, splitting up the boulders, Westwards was used as a road stone quarry in 1920. 2 men, Thackett and Johnston, had permission from the then landowners to break up Sarsen in order to service a road stone contract with the county council. They were to provide cubical pieces of stone and chips of Sarsen for remaking and surfacing the A4 London to Bath road. Now, this is going to be a bit difficult to see, I fear, because of the type of LiDAR visualization that is, but I'll talk you through it. So almost in the middle of Westwards in Hursley Bottom is an area called Stony Copse. And so what I've done here is taken the LiDAR coverage of the area, the LiDAR data set, and I've processed it in what's called an open positive visualization. And what that does is it helps to reduce the impact of the topography of the land. So the land looks quite flat, even though we're in a valley with steep sides, looking at it from above. But what it does is emphasizes the edges of archaeological features. So you should be able to see this narrow sausage-shaped area in the middle. This is Stony Copse from above, and it's full of these speckles. And these speckles are all extraction pits from the 1920 quarry. This is where Thacker and Johnson set up business, and they removed the Sarsen boulders using explosives. They had an underground magazine dug into the valley side, and they had a stone crusher mounted on a large concrete block in the bottom of the quarry as well. And they cleared almost all of Stony Copse. And it's thanks to the dedicated work of the Wiltshire Archaeology Field Group and their surveying work in Westwards that we have such a good idea of what was going on here. And a really important piece of work, which you can download the report from the Archaeology Data Service website. It's published in 2011. Really interesting to take with you when you're in Westwards. We're going to concentrate on this area here in Stony Copse just briefly to look at this detailed analytical earthwork survey of part of the quarry, which shows the impact of that 1920 roadstone quarry on the landscape. So we've got all sorts of higgledy-piggledy extraction pits. Some of them are single holes, quite deep, perhaps for taking out one large boulder. Some of them are really quite complicated holes in the ground, where numerous Sarsen boulders were being taken. The concrete block, which the stone crushing machine was on, is down here. The underground store, the magazine for fuses or explosives that was cut into the hillside, is just down here. We've got these things which are finger dumps, so raised earthen banks This one up here at the top is really characteristic. So as they're pulling the stone out and breaking it up, they're then transporting it out along these banks, down through the road, into the stone crusher, and then it can come back out again. The stone can come back out again and go up off to the north to the A4 for the road. So this is just one small part of this much more extensive quarried area. It was really big, really extensive, but they went bust after 1 year. And now the valley shows the whole process from this completely quarried out area with no sarsen stones left to areas of the wood just to the north where they've got prepared boulders, but that hadn't yet been removed, and all the way through to an area where there are still the sarsen stones surviving in their natural state. So we're going to finish there. I'm going to leave you with this photograph of one of my favorite sarsen stones. It's a really beautiful view. Again, you can go out walking along the ridgeway and take this view in. It's not that far above Avebury, and Silbury Hill is just off the photo to the right hand side. You can go up and visit and walk in this area. There are a few sarsen stones still remaining, including this one. It's really, really lovely. So I'm going to finish there, and I'll stop sharing the screen, and we'll go back to the view of everyone, and maybe you'll have some questions.
Right, well, thank you very, very much, Katy. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm really excited to think we can go and see so much. Questions, please. Anyone got anything, any questions?
I've actually got a comment.
Yes, carry on, Martin.
Yeah, okay. I know a couple who live in a cottage in Avebury, which they say is largely made of sarsen stones. But unfortunately, they say the sarsen stones are porous and the cottage is very damp.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, so yeah, sarsen stones have a really bad reputation in buildings. Despite the fact that they're really durable and really hard, they do contain a proportion of water, just like any rock will contain a proportion of water. It's usually as what's called pore water. So where, if you can imagine all the sand grains touch one another, but then obviously they're not a perfect fit. And then they're glued together with this silica cement. But again, that can be a really perfect, very strong join, binding together the sand grains, or it can be quite variable. So you can get water in the stones, but they have this reputation of sweating as well, and of rotting furniture. So yeah, they're a blessing and a curse, it seems. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear that they've got, they're having that experience even today, and it's one of the things that sarsen stone is well known for. Yeah.
Can I make a brief comment? You might need to explain to some people what LiDAR is.
Yes. Okay, so imagine an airplane that's flying over the landscape, and instead of taking photographs, it's got a piece of machinery inside that can ping a signal down to the ground and receive that signal coming back and record it. Light detection and range, and excuse me, ranging is what LiDAR stands for. And so the signal going down, the signal bouncing back, means that you get a signal off the tops of things, like the tops of trees and the tops of building, but some of the signal can get through things like trees and go as far as the ground and bounce back. And because you're able to capture that, to record that in the device that you've got in your aircraft, you can do a number of things. You can capture, in effect, an image, a three-dimensional image of the surface of the globe, of the area that you're surveying, but you can also strip out the returns from the tops of the trees and the tops of the buildings to remove the trees and remove the buildings and get just the signal that's hit the very ground surface itself. So of course this is brilliant for archaeology, because you can get a lot of really detailed information about archaeology that's not only in open ground but also in woodland. And of course at West Woods, which has in some places a really thick tree cover, in others not so much. But that's why that particular technique is really useful for looking at the archaeological monuments that are there, the features that are there. Thanks for reminding me that, Martin. I should have said that at the time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, any more questions?
Yes, please,
Ian.
if I may. Hello. Katy, fabulous talk. It's given us some wonderful places to walk and find yet more of them. We live in Lower Womborough and on Lower Greensand,
Yeah.
which is full of, well, they're nothing like the boulders that you're talking about, but some, you can see me on the screen, we get
Yep.
stuff about that size, and we've got
Yeah.
some that have got standing stones. A mixture of big chunks of chalk, because they fall apart in no time, as is the house, and that's falling apart as well. But we do have greensand. Is that,
Yeah.
are they Sarsen stones?
Well, they could be. So you get all sorts of things in greensand. In a lot of different types of sand, geological deposits of sands, you can get things that are called doggers. And what that just means is any hard concreted mass. And what might be concreting the sand together, it could be silcrete, that's really the definition of Sarsen stone, that it's silica that's gluing it together. But it could be calcrete. It could be glued together by a calcium carbonate. So it all depends on what's doing the cementing, what's gluing together the sand grains. Now, in greensand, one of the things that you can get in greensand is something that is actually really similar to flint. If you go down to Axminster, if you go and walk along the beaches at Axmouth, for example, with the sea lapping away and the cliffs tumbling down at your side, one of the things you'll find are great big nodules. Again, like you say, the size of your head, or the size of, I don't know, 3 watermelons stuck together. Big nodules. Crack them open, and the inside will be not the perfect glossy black of flint that you expect, but a really dark grey, where parts of the greensand have silicified in a similar way, in a similar way to flint forming, but it's really a chert rather than being a flint. But because greensand is full of glauconite, that's the mineral that really defines greensand, and it gives it that the greenish tinge and the greenish grey colour. When you crack open one of these nodules, you'll see all these brilliantly beautiful green flecks in it, which is the glauconite in amongst this sort of cherty concretion. So yeah, in the greensand, we should expect to find concreted lumps, which could be stuck together by any number of mineral what's the word I'm looking for? Well, a range of minerals. It could be silica, depending on what happened. It could be a calcium carbonate. It could be iron. So it could be a ferricrete. So we've got calcrete now, silcrete, ferricrete. So yeah, it all depends on what makes them. So whether we could define them as Sarsen stone or not. Sarsen really it's a silcrete. It's the silica that's gluing the sands together.
Thank you for that, because we've got red ones as well, so they're ferricrete.
Well, very very likely. I mean, you get a lot of that in towards Essex, for example. The sandy and pebbly geology in Essex, often you get ferricrete, where iron pan, it's sometimes called, has done the gluing together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Liza has raised her hand, so that's all very, very good. Can you, Liza, would you like to ask your question?
So technically, it's Dick.
Right, Dick. Right. Okay.
There we go.
I am here as well, but
I just wanted to add a comment about the doggers.
Yeah.
If you walk down the Old Town Railway path, you pass from the Portland stuff into the Upper Kimmeridge.
Yeah.
And where you get the sandy bits in the Upper Kimmeridge, there are loads of doggers, and you can tell them easily, apart from Sarsen stones, by just trying to scratch them with a steel blade. Calcite cemented doggers will scratch with a screwdriver, but Sarsens won't. No. Sarsens make your blade blunt.
Yeah, ruin your screwdriver.
So when you were talking, when you were showing your map of Swindon and the surrounding area, and in the northeast, there were several naturally occurring, what you said, Sarsens. I think some of those were in what's mapped as the Kimmeridge Formation and are possibly likely to be calcite cemented doggers rather than properly Sarsens.
Yeah, that's highly likely. That's highly likely. This is where we've got this problem about, well, the first problem is not enough investigation. That's the first thing. And secondly, because we know that there was more chalk, there was a lot more chalk. Even where we've still got chalk hills today, before all of the erosion over millions of years, the chalk hills themselves would have been another 100 or 200 meters higher than they are today. And if you imagine the extent of that chalk, including covering what we now think of as Swindon and perhaps the Vale of the White Horse, if we imagine that going off to the east, you know, there was a load more chalk, and there were the tertiary deposits on top of the chalk and Sarsen stone forming. And because without the investigation, we don't know if what we're looking at are things that we would call Sarsen stones that derive from that long history of the of formation over the chalk and then the loss of the chalk, but these hard things still remain. Or, as you say, we're actually talking about something that's slightly different, that comes from another geological deposit, but has similarities. So yeah, but no, it's all research to be done.
Okay, thank you, Dick. John Walsh next. See your hand up. John, are you muted? No, you're not muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Katy, this is actually a question that occurred to me when I went to look at the Dayhouse Lane circle. If you, as you know, if you go there and look at that, you can't avoid the conclusion that someone got there before you and took it away, right? It's more or less sheared off at ground level. So the question that I had in my mind was, I wonder if there's any technique available to archaeologists now that allows them, simply by looking at a stump, to estimate how tall the original thing had been.
Well, unfortunately, John, I think the answer to that question is probably no. And I say that thinking about the standing stones in Avebury. So if you know, imagine the stone circles at Avebury. Imagine the cove, the northern cove that's in the north. Get my compass points in the northeast quadrant at Avebury. One of those really tall stones in the cove at Avebury was leaning, and it was thought to be at risk of falling over. There was an excavation by the side of it because there was a fear that it was really shallow. You know, there was very little stone under the ground, and that the stone was leaning, it was going to fall over, and there'd be a disaster and probably a terrible accident. Well, what did the investigation show? There is more stone buried under the ground than there is above the ground. There's something like 2 meters above the ground and 2.5 or 3 meters or something ridiculous. I forget the exact dimensions, but a massive amount of stone below ground. So really difficult. And because they're irregular, you know, you could have something that's sort of quite small and a bit like an iceberg. What's hidden underground, what you can't see, is absolutely immense. And that's one of the things that you'll see in Westwoods. Not so much now because there's quite a lot of overgrowth, but if you can go in the winter, that's the best time to go. If you want to go and look at Sarsen stones in Westwoods, go in the winter and go in the parts of the quarry where they prepared Sarsen stones for removal but never removed them. There are some huge boulders with gullies dug all the way around them, trying to get the soil away so that when they're using explosives to split the stone, the force will actually travel through the stone and break it, and then they can collect the pieces. They're immense, and if you imagine that, you can see where the ground level had been, and so they are often like icebergs. So I can't think of a technique that we could use at the stone circle. What we can do, there has been some geophysical survey work there. There are some reports you could get from the Historic Environment Record in Chippenham. Maybe the time is to have a look at that and perhaps maybe do some more detailed work there, if possible. Obviously, it's a scheduled monument, so we'd need permission, but it would be really good to do more work around Coates and around Coate Water.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more hands up? Oh, Sue Gray.
Yeah, you were talking about the wedges, Katie.
Yeah.
What, or is this a really ancient one? I thought that they heated them from underneath with a fire and then poured cold water on them to split them.
Yeah, so that's a technique that's reported both by John Aubrey and William Stukely in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's described like it's a technique that's unique to Avebury, and they're using them to bust up the stones that had actually been used in the prehistoric monument. Because they wanted to, well, there's a lot of different things going on at Avebury, including some people wanting to make it easier to cultivate ground, or to use it for farming. So they want to clear stones away. So in the Middle Ages, they do that by pushing the stones over into pits and burying them, because that gains you an extra few square meters of ground. And then there's this technique that develops in the area in the 17th, and it's used in the 17th century, and it's used up to around about the sort of 1720s, 1730s to break the stones up by burning them and throwing water on. Absolutely right. It's not unique to Avebury. It's used elsewhere. It's used at later dates and times as well. It's actually a perfectly normal and really very convenient quarrying technique. And you can read treatises on quarrying that go right back to the 15 and 1600s, 1700s, treatises on quarrying that describe doing this. You can use it, for example, if what you actually want is metalliferous ores. You're trying to get ores out of the ground, and you use fire to bust up the stone that you move away to actually then get to the vein of the really rich stuff that you want. So that's certainly being used. And you can make some really nice building blocks out of it. And you'll see a lot of buildings, especially around the Kennet Valley, quite high status buildings, also in the Ogbournes, in the Og Valley as well. Really beautiful buildings with quite well-shaped blocks, nicely coursed, that don't appear to have been split using this new technique that was brought from Buckinghamshire. They probably were split by hand. But it's one of the things to remember about Sarsen stone. You can make it split in these nice straight lines, and it will do it because the stone is so homogeneous, because it's just all of these millions of grains of sand cemented together by silica. And that homogeneity is what enables you to break it in these nice straight lines. So it's definitely one of the techniques that's being used. But the way that it's been documented and the way that archaeologists have talked about it does tend to be a little bit kind of privileges it. It privileges it as a technique, and actually it's quite a normal sort of a thing to do. Yeah. So I think.
Thank you, Charles. Charles Stewart.
Has anybody looked for or found rare earth elements amongst the Sarsen?
Well, I think there are two things to say to that. A geologist called Hilary Howard did some work for Mike Pitts, and it's published in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society in 1996, I think. And what Hilary was doing was looking for heavy elements, and that was quite an innovative thing to do. Nobody had done that before with Sarsen stone. And then most recently, Professor David Nash at the University of Brighton and his team have been doing geochemical fingerprinting of Sarsen stone, which is how we've got these amazing results that all bar two of Stonehenge's Sarsen stones come from the Westwoods area. Now, from what I remember of the list of all of the elements that works with, none of them are rare earth elements. And but it is the geochemical fingerprinting of that final few percent of minerals that are in Sarsen stone. So I mentioned that it's pretty much all quartz, because it's all quartz sand grains glued together by silica. So most Sarsen stone is like 97, 98% silica. It's just that final couple of percent. It might be 0.5%, it might be 1.5 or 2%. That final percent of other minerals that were in the parent sand, or in amongst the parent sand, that then got cemented together, that David's technique uses. So there's things like titanium, zirconium, there are iron oxides, manganese, potassium oxides. There's those sorts of things in there that are being used in that technique.
And nickel, cobalt, and that group.
Yeah. So I think that's the closest kind of work that's ever been done in that area.
Okay, so there's nobody going to mine Sarsen for rare earth.
Well, there's so little else in it. I mean, I think it would not be economically viable, I guess. Yeah. I think Melinda's got a question. And I think Irene had a question as well, although she's put her camera off.
Yeah, okay. Belinda.
You're on mute still though, Melinda.
Melinda.
Hello?
Great, that's fine.
Does anybody want to have a record of any recent found Sarsen stones?
Yes, me. Okay, so no, go on. Do go on.
My mother's bungalow was dug out in Rawton, and all the Sarsen stones were shoved to the front, and she gave some to the council for the play area for people to sit on in circles. But that's fairly recent, 90s.
Yes.
And if you want to know, I could record that and let you have that information.
That would be brilliant, because I think I've got photographs of those very Sarsen stones as an example of them being used in this way. Because one of the things that I'm interested in is not only the ways they've been used in prehistory, not only these different quarrying techniques and methods, but how they're used today. And it's not just in buildings. If you go to Berwick St James, Berwick Bassett, and the churches in the Winterbourne Valley, for example, and go in the graveyards there, you'll see amazing Sarsen headstones that some people have used. You get them there, but you also get them in the Vale of Pewsey as well, in the churchyards there. There's an example in Ashbury. So just over the border, Ashbury in Oxfordshire. I mentioned Berrycroft Farm, which has hundreds of Sarsen stones on its land. They were asked by a neighbour if a neighbour could have a Sarsen stone from their collection to put up in his garden. He's a latter day a modern druid, and he wanted to have his own standing stone in his garden. And it seems to me to be, it's really interesting that people are still doing this. But yeah. Anywhere that people are encountering the stones and then using them in different ways, you've reminded me. This made me laugh when I first found out about it. I was doing some research, and one of the reasons that Bryn Walters and Bernard Phillips were able to make so many Sarsen stone records in the 1970s for that project that they volunteered with is because those parts of South and Southeast Swindon and round Rawton were being developed. The housing estates were being built at the time. And just like the bungalow, builders were digging up Sarsen stones or whatever, finding these things. And the Swindon Council at the time must have had quite a lot of these, because at one point it sold some to Bournemouth City Council. And if you go down to the Chine in Bournemouth, where the pleasure gardens are, and there are kind of things like sort of fairground rides and things down there. There's a big rockery, and there's a load of Sarsen stones in there as well. And when I first saw those, I thought, oh, that's good, because Hampshire and Dorset have got Sarsen stones naturally. They've got their own Sarsen stones, and I thought, oh yes, I would expect to see them in this rockery. Very good, excellent. I'm pleased to see those. Turns out they're probably from Swindon, of all places. The county, Hampshire and Dorset, they've got their own. Dorset's got their own Sarsen stones, but no, they thought they'd buy them and go to the trouble to probably in a truck take them all the way down from Swindon to Bournemouth to use in the rockery. I mean, yeah. So I'm really interested in all of these uses and why people are doing these things. Yeah, that'd be great. Irene, you had a question.
Yeah. Well, on a lighter note, we've got a Sarsen under the extension of my house here at the bottom of Lawn Woods. And it's quite a shock when you're digging out, which my husband was, digging out to build an extension, to come across this thing and having to put some sort of concrete things across it, have extra building inspection and all sorts. But that is a lighter note. But the other lighter note is that I've had all this wrong all my life, and I'm very sorry to admit how wrong I've been. We had a lot of contact with the farms at Dayhouse Lane, and I used to take my children along those roads. And I believed, because I'm sure I was told, that they had been washed down in water, because it does look like a stream. Those stones appear to have been washed down, and or it was to do with melting of glaciers and stones coming out of a glacier. So obviously I've been totally wrong all this time, so I have to confess to that. But the people on the farm must have thought that, because I was told that so many years ago. Mm-hmm. Was there any kind of folklore about those two methods, water or glaciers, in your research? Obviously not from these people, and I'll have to go and repair this damage I've done to my own children.
No, not at all. I mean, it is one of those things, because they are these rather strange looking boulders. Like I mentioned, the kind of all those old theories about why there were these strange boulders in a chalk landscape, they've got to be explained. And of course they do look like glacial erratics. They look like they don't belong, and that's what glacial erratics are. They're boulders that have moved perhaps hundreds of kilometers from, Scotland or Scandinavia, and are found hundreds of kilometers south, where they've been moved by the ice. So it's totally understandable that's one of the kind of explanatory stories about them. But we know now, really, since the early 19th century, that's not the case. But saying that, Sarsen stones, of course, intimately tied to Stonehenge. They're a huge part of the monument, erected, the trilithons and the stone circle erected around about 2500 BC. And that means they're associated with bluestones. Now, there is still a debate in some quarters about how the bluestones got to the Salisbury Plain. And there are plenty of people, myself included, who absolutely believe that people were moving them and shifting them that great distance. But there are still some people who are equally adamant that no, they must have been, why would people move stones over those great distances? And it must have been some kind of glacial deposit. And so Sarsen stones still do get kind of caught up in those questions. But we can be very clear, they are silcretes. They formed in a completely different way, and they are where we expect them to be, not because of the ice. You mentioned the movement of water, and up in the Valley of Stones, the way that the stones fill up the valley bottom, they get described as Sarsen streams, as though the stones themselves are streaming down the valley. And that's not far off, really, because that is to do with what was happening in the thaw at the very end of the last ice age. So there's no ice here at the time, but we are in permafrost. It's that cold, it's kind of tundra. Imagine the area like that. No ice, but it is still really cold. There is permafrost, and the Sarsen stones, some lying about on the surface, some buried in these clayey, sticky deposits. Imagine in the warming temperature, maybe even just the warmth of the sun, warming that up enough to turn it into a sludge of clay and flints and Sarsen stone cobbles and boulders. And so they will move downhill, even with only a very shallow gradient. And you can imagine landslips bringing them down off the higher ground into the valley bottoms and kind of giving this effect of the streams. They are being weathered. They are being weathered by water, by knocking other boulders, by the flints and the clay that they're mixed up with having a kind of grinding effect. So that is happening to them. It's not far off that idea of the kind of worked by water.
Okay, well, thank you, Katy. That was just fabulous. And I think we ought to stop now, because otherwise I think we could go on all night, because I think everybody's got something to say about Sarsen stones. I think that's the thing, because it's, they're so sort of close to us, aren't they? They're part of our landscape. And I think what I'm going to say is, if anybody has got any more questions, I will forward them to Katy, if that's all right, Katy, because I've sensed that there is more, but I think we ought to stop now. And I'll certainly put you in touch with Melinda.
Yeah, that would be great.
Well, you know, so you've got each other's emails, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Hopefully that's okay with Melinda. Yeah,
Yes.
but definitely I'm happy for my email address to be shared. That's fine.
I've got one in the garden.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye now, and thank you so much, Katy. I don't think we've ever had so many questions. Okay, so thank you very much.
My pleasure. I'm really pleased that I could come and talk to you all. Thank you very much for having me, everyone.
You. That's brilliant.
Great.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Katy.